What if a 5-day war could change the map, displace thousands, and leave wounds that still haven't healed? In a small country nestled between mountains and history, that's exactly what happened. This is the story of Georgia nation caught between old struggles and new hopes and the military conflict that shook it to its core. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, many regions that were once held together under one flag began to pull apart. Georgia was one of those newly independent nations, but within its borders lived groups who didn't fully identify as Georgian. Two of these regions were South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The people there had their own languages, cultures, and history, and many of them wanted independence. This desire wasn't new, had been building for decades. When Georgia became independent, these regions saw a chance to separate, but Georgia, trying to hold its new country together, couldn't accept that. That's where the conflict began. In the early 1990s, fighting broke out between Georgian forces and separatists in both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These early wars ended with ceasefires, but the regions remained in a tense and unresolved state. Russian peacekeepers were stationed there, but many believed Russia was more supportive of the separatists than neutral. Over the years, the regions became semi-independent, with their own local governments and a strong presence of Russian influence. Georgia considered them part of its sovereign territory, but the people living there had a different idea. This tension built over time, becoming part of Georgia's daily political and emotional life. The wounds from the early 1990s never healed, and each side told its own story about who belonged where and why. The world watched, but didn't intervene deeply. While diplomacy was attempted, the truth was that trust had broken down on all sides. Families who had once lived peacefully as neighbors became divided by fear, borders, and suspicion. The origins of the war are rooted in these emotions, in the loss of connection, and in the fight over identity about who belongs and who gets to decide what a nation is. In the years following its independence from the Soviet Union, Georgia began looking westward for support, partnerships, and protection. It sought closer ties with the United States and Europe, and especially with NATO, a powerful military alliance led by Western countries. Georgia believed that joining NATO would help secure its borders, protect its sovereignty, and deter further interference from Russia. This desire was not just about military strength, it was also about values. Georgia wanted to be seen as part of the democratic and free world, aligning itself with countries that respected independence, rule of law, and open societies. But to Russia, this shift felt deeply threatening. Russia had long considered Georgia part of its traditional sphere of influence. Seeing Georgia grow closer to NATO and the European Union sparked a deep sense of alarm in Moscow. It wasn't only about politics, it was also about geography and power. If Georgia joined NATO, it would mean NATO forces could be stationed very close to Russia's southern border, something the Russian leadership strongly opposed. Over time, Russia began using political pressure, economic tactics, and support for separatist regions to keep Georgia from making that leap. The situation was further complicated by the fact that NATO expressed support for Georgia's eventual membership but didn't offer a clear path forward. This created a tense limbo, where Georgia was moving westward but remained vulnerable. That in-between space made everything more dangerous. Russia, feeling cornered and protective of its influence, began reinforcing its position in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Georgia, feeling isolated but determined, saw NATO as a way out of its insecurity. This tug-of-war over alliances and influence became one of the invisible forces pulling the region toward war. The more Georgia moved west, the more Russia pulled back in resistance, setting the stage for confrontation. On the night of August 7, 2008, tensions that had been simmering for years finally erupted into open conflict. The Georgian government, believing that Russian-backed separatists in South Ossetia were preparing for a large-scale attack, launched a military operation to regain control over the region. Georgian forces moved quickly into the South Ossetia capital of Chinvali, using heavy artillery and ground troops to assert control. From Georgia's perspective, It was a defensive move aimed at protecting its citizens and restoring national integrity. But within hours, the situation escalated beyond what anyone had fully anticipated. Russia responded with overwhelming force, claiming to be protecting Russian citizens, many of whom had been given Russian passports in South Ossetia. Moscow launched a full-scale military invasion. Russian tanks, jets, and troops crossed the border, attacking not only South Ossetia, but also targets deep inside Georgia. The Russian military had been conducting exercises near the border just days earlier, allowing for a rapid and organized response. Fighting quickly spread beyond the original conflict zone. Russian airstrikes targeted military bases, bridges, and civilian infrastructure in cities far from the front lines. Meanwhile, Abkhazian separatists opened a second front in the west, putting additional pressure on Georgian forces. Within a short span of time, Georgian troops were forced to retreat from South Ossetia as Russian forces advanced. The speed and scale of Russia's military response shocked many observers around the world. By August 12, the fighting had mostly stopped, but the damage was already immense. Thousands of civilians had fled their homes, hundreds were dead or wounded, and the political map of the region was changing. What began as a localized military operation by Georgia quickly turned into a broader war that drew global attention and reshaped the balance of power in the Caucasus. When Russian forces entered Georgia in response to the Georgian attack on South Ossetia, they did so with a level of military strength that quickly overwhelmed the Georgian army. Russia deployed thousands of troops, advanced tanks, artillery, and aircraft in a coordinated and highly effective offensive. While Georgia had a modernizing military and had received training from NATO countries, it was no match for the scale and experience of the Russian forces. Russia not only pushed Georgian forces out of South Ossetia, but also moved beyond the conflict zone, striking targets deep within Georgia, including military bases, communication centers, and even civilian infrastructure. Airstrikes hit towns like Gori, close to the South Ossetian border, causing panic among civilians and forcing thousands to flee. The Georgian government struggled to defend its territory and to maintain order as Russian troops advanced toward the capital, Tbilisi. Though Russian forces stopped short of entering the capital, their presence nearby created fear of a full occupation. In addition to the main military push, Russian naval forces also blockaded parts of Georgia's Black Sea coast, further tightening the pressure. The superiority of the Russian military was evident not just in numbers, but also in coordination, logistics, and control of the air. Georgian forces were forced to retreat quickly, and in many cases, abandon equipment and positions to avoid being encircled. The speed of Russia's advance and the depth of its strikes suggested the operation had been pre-planned to some degree, and it caught Georgia and much of the international community by surprise. The 5-day war revealed how quickly modern warfare could escalate and how vulnerable smaller countries could be when facing a much larger and better equipped opponent, even if they had support from Western allies in other forms. As the fighting intensified and international concern grew, a ceasefire was urgently needed to stop the destruction. On August 12, 2008, a peace agreement was brokered by the European Union, led by then-French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who traveled between Moscow and Tbilisi to negotiate a deal. The agreement included terms for both sides to cease hostilities, pull back their troops to pre-conflict positions, allow humanitarian aid, and begin international discussions on the future of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Georgia quickly accepted the terms, hoping to end the devastation, while Russia also agreed but continued to occupy key areas beyond South Ossetia and Abkhazia, even after the ceasefire was signed. In the days and weeks that followed, Russia began to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, a move that was condemned by Georgia and most of the international community. Only a handful of countries followed Russia's lead, while the United Nations and Western governments continued to affirm Georgia's territorial integrity. Russia maintained a heavy military presence in both regions, building bases and reinforcing border controls. Georgia, on the other hand, lost effective control over the territories, and was left with thousands of internally displaced persons who could not return to their homes. The war had a lasting impact on Georgia's internal politics and security, pushing it even closer to the West, while also deepening its vulnerability. Despite calls for Russian withdrawal from occupied areas, Russian forces remained, solidifying a new status quo. The ceasefire stopped the open warfare, but it did not bring true peace. The issues that led to the conflict remained unresolved, and the war left deep scars, physically, politically, and emotionally, all sides. The events of August 2008 redefined borders and relationships in the region, with consequences that continue to shape diplomacy and security in the Caucasus. The consequences of the war did not end with the ceasefire. For Georgia, the loss of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as functioning parts of its territory was a painful blow. These regions were now under the control of Russian military and local separatist authorities. With new borders enforced by soldiers and checkpoints, the thousands of ethnic Georgians who once lived in those areas were either displaced or unable to return due to threats, destruction, or fear of persecution. Georgia was left to care for large numbers of internally displaced people, many of whom had already suffered from earlier conflicts. The war also had a profound effect on Georgia's politics and foreign policy. It deepened the country's desire to join NATO and the European Union, seeing these institutions as the best way to protect its future. At the same time, it exposed the limits of Western support. While Western countries offered political backing and humanitarian aid, they did not intervene militarily during the conflict, which left many in Georgia feeling isolated. For Russia, the war was a signal of its return to assertive regional influence. By recognizing South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent, Russia challenged the international order and re-established itself as the dominant power in the Caucasus. It also warned other former Soviet countries against moving too close to the West. The war strained Russia's relations with NATO and the European Union, leading to years of mistrust and tension that affected diplomacy and cooperation on other global issues. The conflict also set a precedent for how Russia might act in similar situations, as seen later in Ukraine. For the people of the region, especially those who lost homes and loved ones, the war left behind unresolved pain. The borders may have shifted, but the memories and consequences of those 5 days remain vivid and unresolved. The story of the Georgia military attack war is more than a tale of battles and borders. It's a reminder of how fragile peace can be, and how deeply people are affected when nations clash. From long-standing tensions in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, to Georgia's desire for independence and Western alignment, and Russia's powerful response. The war unfolded with speed, force, and lasting consequences. In just 5 days, lives were lost, homes were abandoned, and the region was forever changed. Yet, even in the face of such conflict, the human spirit continues to search for understanding, dignity, and healing. This history teaches us that beyond politics and power, it is the voices of ordinary people, those who lived through fear, loss, and displacement, that truly define the cost of war. And in remembering their stories, we hold space for hope, for dialogue, and for a more peaceful future.